Hi, thanks for downloading The Inquiry from the BBC World Service. We're a weekly program. Our job is to add in-depth analysis to one question from the news. We hope you like it.
BBC World Service, this is Helena Merriman with The Inquiry. In November, hackers broke into Sony's computers. It was the most damaging corporate cyber attack in American history. A few weeks later, the hackers threatened to target any cinemas that screened The Interview, a film about an American plot to assassinate Kim Jong Un. An FBI investigation, which some have questioned, concluded that North Korea was to blame for the cyber attack, and President Obama announced new sanctions against the country and its leaders.
This is the first time our government has taken a move like this in response to a direct cyber attack on a U.S. company. And the White House says there is more to come.
North Korea responded angrily, calling Mr. Obama reckless and a monkey. It's a spat that paints North Korea's young leader, Kim Jong Un, as impetuous. But how much do we really know about him? So in this week's inquiry, we're asking, what does Kim Jong Un want? Before we hear from our first expert witness, we're going to introduce a piece of evidence to this week's inquiry. It's Kim Jong Un's New Year address, delivered on state TV, in which he announced his plans for the country.
Part 1. What does he want? To survive.
우리 당의 인민사랑, 후대사랑의 정치와 과학중시, 교육중시 정책이 현실에 구현되어 당에 대한 인민들의 신뢰가 두터워지고 우리의 일심단결이 공고화되었습니다.
In Kim Jong-un's speech, he talked about the party's politics of love for the people. In fact, he used the word party 33 times. It suggests his greatest concern, ensuring the survival of the Kim dynasty that has led the party and the country since it was founded.
Now, a lot of what he's had to do over the last couple of years is shore up support.
This is Jean Lee. She was born in America to South Korean parents and grew up hearing stories about the Korean families separated by the war there in 1953. A few years ago, she became the first foreign journalist to open a bureau inside North Korea.
He is very young. He doesn't have the decades of experience that his father had. He doesn't have the guerrilla fighter persona that his grandfather had. So certainly he spent the first few years of his leadership trying to shore up support among all the different entities, the different generations.
Part of shoring up support involves stepping out of his father's shadow. After all, the very first time the public was introduced to him, Kim Jong Un was at a military parade with his father. Jean Lee was there.
When he came out, there was just a complete sense of shock and awe among the people at the plaza because they had never seen him. They had never seen a picture of him. They had only really known of his existence officially a few weeks earlier, if you can imagine. And here he was coming out onto the viewing platform to watch the parade next to his father.
As they watched parades of soldiers and armoured trucks, Kim Jong Un, dressed in a blue civilian suit, stood next to his uniformed father, looking slightly out of place.
Now, he was incredibly young at the time, very baby-faced, in his late 20s, and so it was quite a shock to see somebody so young who was being groomed to be the next leader. He was not the oldest son, so wasn't the obvious shoo-in. There's clearly something about him, ambition, perhaps a kind of ruthlessness, some qualities that his father saw in him that he thought would carry this country into the next generation.
The world saw that ruthlessness a year ago when he ordered the execution of his once powerful uncle for allegedly trying to overthrow the state. It's clear that Kim Jong Un will continue to use violence to assert his authority, not only within the elite, It's well established that the North Korean regime uses violence and torture to quash dissent amongst ordinary people too. But Jean Lee says it would be a mistake to think Kim Jong Un wants to maintain control only through fear.
One of the things that I've seen on the ground over the past couple of years is all the construction of these skating rinks. There's actually a skateboard park, the ski resort, of course, that opened last year, massive projects. I see all of this as an investment that they're making in the future. It's the only way that I can really understand it. He is a young man. If he is going to maintain the support or win the support of the future generations of North Koreans who are going to be his power base, he's got to find a way to take care of them, to win their loyalty, and this, I think, is part of that.
So Kim Jong Un wants to use his youth to win over North Korea's younger generations. It's his strategy for long-term survival. But Jean Lee says that he also wants to make some bigger changes. Even if most North Koreans are cut off from the outside world, Kim Jong Un is only too aware of what's happening beyond his country's heavily guarded borders.
I think it was clear from the New Year's address that he and the leadership are watching the world around them change, the kind of sweeping changes that are taking place in China, and so very aware that they need to make some changes.
But what kind of changes might Kim Jong Un want to make?
Part 2. What does he want? A stronger economy.
우리는 이미 마련된 자립경제의 토대와 온갖 잠재력을 최대로 발동하여 인민 생활 향상과 경제강국 건설에서 전환을 이룩하여야 합니다.
We should bring about a turn in improving the people's living standards and build an economic giant, said Kim Jong Un in that New Year address. Easy to promise. But is economic reform realistic when North Korea is still so heavily dependent on China for much of its food and fuel? It's hard to get reliable data on the most closed economy in the world. So we're going to introduce you to someone who's seen what's happening on the ground.
The challenge in discussing North Korea, especially in relation to the work that we do, is that people don't understand the degree to which changes are happening in the country.
This is Jeffrey See. He's a Singaporean who's been travelling back and forth to North Korea for the past 7 years, conducting workshops with young entrepreneurs. He says North Koreans are now thinking in innovative ways about the economy, and that this new thinking is coming from the top.
So back in about 6 years ago, when we first started our program in North Korea, our counterparts would often start off with a very long spiel about socialism and how this is the system they have and they're never going to change it. What we've noticed in recent years is that instead of saying that, people talk about how they are trying to bring in what's best from overseas and try to adjust it to fit into the system. So I think that's a very interesting change in terms of thinking.
But take a look at where this new investment is going, and it suggests a broader plan. It's not just about building North Korea's economy, it's a strategic move.
If you look at the economic zones that North Korea was investing in, one of the key areas is Wonsan. So this is an economic zone on the east coast of North Korea. It faces Japan and it borders South Korea. So it's kind of almost the furthest location you can have from China. So we believe that it's part of this broader aim to balance off Chinese economic influence in North Korea.
Kim Jong Un has also been making overtures to Russia's President Putin. 2 years ago, Russia wrote off 90% of North Korea's debt, promising to reinvest in the country. But there aren't that many foreign investors willing to pour large sums of money into a country with such an idiosyncratic business environment.
One of the funny quirks of working in North Korea is that we would email the North Koreans, 2, 3, 4 times, and we don't get a response. And we used to get very worried about it. We wonder if they are reading our messages, if things are moving ahead. And we would go in like 3 months later from the first set of emails. And when we meet with them, we ask them, do you receive our emails? And the response is always like, you are coming in 3 months' time. We didn't feel the need to send a response because, we can just chat when you're back in here.
Of course, it's not just the slow pace of communication that puts off investors. The unpredictable behaviour of Kim Jong Un hasn't helped. Take the execution of his uncle we mentioned earlier. So here's a leader with a dilemma. He wants to build the economy, but he can't do it unless he can make North Korea a more attractive place to do business. And, like his predecessors, he has bigger ambitions than this.
Part 3. The Big Prize.
우리는 비록 정세가 복잡하고 장애와 난관이 가로놓여 있어도 위대한 수령님과 장군님의 필생인 염원이며 민족 최대의 수건인 조국 통일을 기호히 이룩하고 이 땅 위에 졸업 높고 부흥하는 통일 강국을 일도 세워야 합니다.
Whatever obstacles and difficulties may stand in our way, Kim Jong Un said in that New Year address, we should unfailingly achieve national reunification, the greatest desire of the nation. He offered to hold talks at the highest level with South Korea, a move which the South Koreans described as meaningful. It was, perhaps, inevitable that he would talk about reunification. 2015 is the 70th anniversary of the division of Korea after the Second World War. But will he really pursue reunification in earnest? Here's our third expert witness.
What makes him different from to Kim is that he will succeed in getting what he wants.
This is Kim Myong-chol. He was born and lives in Japan, but he's ethnically Korean. He's been to North Korea more than 20 times in the last 40 years, and he says he's met, as he puts it, the two Kims, Kim Jong Un's father and his grandfather. He hasn't met Kim Jong Un yet, but he's a great admirer. Why?
His guts and I say determination and his intelligence.
Guts, determination and intelligence. You can see why some have described Kim Myong-chol as an unofficial spokesman. But it's not just for his love of the regime. In his many trips to the country, he says he's met representatives of North Korea's elite. So he has a better idea than most about what Kim Jong Un wants.
The reunification of Korea without foreign interference. Eventually the United States of America will leave Korea. And the Korean peninsula will be reunified. That's my conclusion here.
But how will it do that? How will it force America to leave Korea?
They realize the futility, senselessness of American military presence in Korea. North Korea became too strong for America. We have now nuclear weapons, we have ICBM, we have hydrogen bomb.
By ICBM, he means intercontinental ballistic missiles that can deliver those nuclear bombs. If he's echoing conversations he's had in Pyongyang, he illustrates the ambition of thinking there, as well as the extent to which North Korea's leadership is driven by a hatred of America.
We are victims of American aggression. North Korea is a most sanctioned country, brutalized, criminalized, isolated by America.
Brutalised, criminalised and isolated by America, he says. It's why Kim Jong Un is deliberately so unpredictable, he argues, so he can try to outsmart the US.
North Korea is a very small country. United States of America is a big country with nuclear weapons. How to defeat the enemy? Outsmart them. So look very bizarrely, look unpredictable. That's the only way North Korea can survive and outsmart America.
So Kim Jong Un wants to wrong foot America. He wants to ensure his own and the party's survival. He wants a stronger economy, but his great dream is reunification. So our next question in this week's inquiry is this.
Part 4. Can he get what he wants?
우리 당과 광화국 정부는 평화를 사랑하고 자주와 정의를 지향하는 세계 진보적 인민들과의 유대와 연대성을 백방으로 강화하며 우리나라의 자주권을 존중하고 우리를 우호적으로 대하는 모든 나라들과의 설린 우호 관계를 적극 발전시켜 나갈 것입니다.
At the end of his New Year address, Kim Jong Un said he would strive to develop good neighbourly relations with all the countries that respect our sovereignty and are friendly to us. The list of countries friendly to North Korea is pretty small, and it was striking that in his speech, Kim Jong Un didn't mention the country right at the top of that list: China.
Simply, North Korea relies on China for survival.
This is Yan Mei-shia. A senior China analyst for the International Crisis Group in Beijing, much of her work involves looking at the relationship between China and North Korea. She says there's not much that Kim Jong Un can do without China.
If China cut the fuel supply across the Yalu River, which is between North Korea and China, then the regime or the country will collapse in a matter of weeks. So Beijing plays a very crucial and vital role in the Korean Peninsula.
And when North Korea does something that China doesn't like, its punishment is both swift and exact.
When there were reports and intelligence saying that North Korea could be on the brink of a fourth nuclear test, China slowed down fuel supply and food aid to North Korea. But before it did that, China looked into the fuel supply and harvest of grain in North Korea and calculated the amount of reduction in order to make sure that the reduction would not cause instability in North Korea. So all these things that China did was meant to send signal of displeasure, but not to destabilize the regime or not to cause real pain.
If Kim Jong-un's plans depend on China, then in the last part of this week's inquiry, we want to know what it is that China would support. First, let's take his big dream, reunification.
Very unlikely. China is the one that has the most realistic understanding of the capability of the Kim Jong Un regime, knowing that without China, the regime itself is not able to provide basic service infrastructure to its own people, let alone to the entire Korean peninsula.
So reunification is unlikely. What about economic reform? Yan Mei-shia says China is in favour of this, but that there's little evidence it's happening.
So I visited the joint economic zone that's jointly run by the two countries. And 80% of the shops or businesses are Chinese. And most of them are just small businesses like shoe factories, workshops, and seafood process factories. So there's no industrialization, despite what North Korea would have hoped for. Because even for Chinese businessmen, they're not willing to invest majorly in North Korea, given the uncertainty.
If anything, she says, the business environment is getting worse.
I met with a Chinese businessman who has been doing business with North Koreans for 20 years. And he said it has been becoming harder to communicate with North Korean side. He can no longer call into his business partner in North Korea. He can only wait for their calls because the control on the other side has tightened.
Since when? When did the control tighten?
Since about 2 or 3 years ago.
In other words, since Kim Jong Un came to power. So Yan Mei-shia isn't convinced that his desire for economic change is genuine. She thinks he's focused on one goal above all others.
I think primarily for Kim Jong Un, the primary goal is regime survival and regime longevity.
And she says in this respect, China will make sure that Kim Jong Un gets what he wants, because China needs North Korea.
North Korea used to be a military buffer for China in terms of heading off any potential advance of U.S. armies. But now in the age of naval and air dominance of the United States, so land war is not as important. But North Korea remains a political buffer in that it is a buffer between China and South Korea, which remains a U.S. ally.
So it's in China's interest for the regime to survive. North Korea is the only thing standing between China and the 28,000 American soldiers stationed in South Korea.
So China shares the interest of managing Kim Jong Un, but I think sometimes people confuse that with signs that China is ready to abandon the Kim Jong Un regime. But actually it's the opposite. China is stabilizing the regime to preserve the current status quo.
But this mutual need doesn't make them close allies.
There isn't really much love between the two countries. It's really purely a relationship of cold-hearted, clear-eyed geopolitical calculation on both sides.
So Kim Jong Un knows that he has to tread carefully. If he annoys the Chinese, he risks freezing the country when China cuts off the fuel. But with China's need to prolong Kim Jong Un's regime, threats to its very existence look unlikely. And its nuclear weapons program means you'd think twice about destabilising it. But what about a threat from within? Here's Jeffrey C. again.
There's a lot of pressure to produce results for the people. There's growing awareness of how East Asia has become very prosperous, and I think people are hoping to see some of that prosperity pop up in their life.
Even if he's unable to deliver on his big economic promises, it's unlikely that North Koreans will be able to do much to show their disappointment.
I was in North Korea, and I was traveling in the Northwest for a few days. In every village, they have this very neat complex with neat rows of houses. They have neighborhood watch going down each row every day to check if people are in their house. And also the whole country is grid managed. So the country is divided into grid. And North Koreans, they cannot travel beyond their grid without government permission. And a border of each grid is manned by military checkpoints. And there's no internet in the country. Our North Korean guys had never heard of Arab Spring. So, they cannot travel, they cannot communicate, they cannot organize. They're pretty much very minimal chance for any bottom-up uprising to be successful. And so any threat to the regime has to come from within the elite. And so far we have seen that Kim Jong Un has been quite skillful in consolidating his power.
This inquiry has heard that Kim Jong Un wants regime survival, reunification and a stronger economy. And he's likely to get some of that. There are no great threats to his regime, thanks to China's support, but his dream of reunification is far-fetched. His ambition to reform the economy could bring results, but only if he finds a way through the dilemma that Jean Lee outlines.
The challenge for him is to find a way to build up the economy without losing control over the people.
It's likely that Kim Jong Un's goal of a stronger economy will ultimately be trumped by his desire for political control. He's only the third Kim to rule the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, and he's seen the strategy of ruling through fear work for both his father and grandfather. An improved economy offers a small incentive for change, but perhaps not enough of one to risk what he wants above all else, to survive.
The Inquiry is produced in London by Simon Mabin and Neil Rizal. We want to know what you want to know, so demand an inquiry. Contact us at the World Service Facebook page or via Twitter at BBC The Inquiry.